an interdisciplinary center, but I can see by the people who are here today that actually we're going to be a little more interdisciplinary than usual, which is good. So, Adrian, would you like to say who you are?
I think for a moment who am I? I'm usually conflict to my Swedish or English. I was born in England, but I lived in Sweden for a long time. I'm a professor in psychology at Gothenburg, and my areas of research are consciousness and the paranormal. Yeah. So, I'm a clinical psychologist originally, I should say.
So, and even more unusual.
Yes, I'm Annika from living in Gothenburg, but from Berlin, and I'm a freelance researcher, and my background is I have a PhD in philosophy and have worked on projects about exceptional human experiences, so more or less the same area as Adrian.
I think we need some more chairs. Okay, well, anyways, I'm glad to see that we have a nice gathering of different people here with different backgrounds. And
soon it's only me who haven't presented myself.
no, but now I'm going to introduce you a little, and then you have to help me by filling in some more. But especially, of course, I would like to say welcome to Erik, who is today's seminar responsible person, lecturer. I don't want to say that because we always want a little discussion here. But so he got his PhD from Umeå, up in the north of Sweden, where he became interested in robots, and he has been interested in robots. I don't know, for as long as I have known you, which is probably what, about four years or so?
Yeah, at least, yeah.
Yeah. He's been interested in robots, and we have discussed many different things during these past years. He's also been a member of the Swedish cognitive science program, graduate program. We have a so-called, what they call in Sweden, research school, forskarskola, national research school, which is now coming to an end. And Erik, of course, was able to get out of it before it came to an end, so he got his PhD, was it last year? Yeah.
Yeah, it was. It's almost 1.5 years ago.
1.5 years ago. Then he was employed in Skövde, or in Scaffolded, as perhaps some people say. I don't know. And there, as far as I know, you continue to work on robots. And one of your favorite themes has been this thing about perception and expectations and predictions and so on. That's also been going on for a fairly long time. And today, I guess you were going to tell us some recent ideas, and we hope that you're going to ask us some controversial questions so we get some.
I hope so too.
Okay, welcome. Yeah.
Tack så jättemycket, Jas. Okay, I'm very happy to see so many faces here. It's always very nice with this relatively small seminar room, and then it's packed with people. I was here last time. I was here. That was in the fall. And I had more of a traditional sort of robotics lecture showing a lot of videos and stuff on cognitive science related robotics, you could say. And it was a very nice presentation. It was also in the evening, so that made it extra. So I hope that to sort of experience a little bit of the same. And one of the things that I really liked was the many questions from the audience. So I have prepared a lot of slides, but we don't feel any pressure that I should finish them actually, but rather, stop me and raise your hand when you want to discuss something. I put the title of today's lecture like this, and actually, I mean, when I started to speak with Jens, we wanted to focus a bit on this role of prediction but I will just as much sort of stress this idea of perception and action as two very connected processes, or rather sometimes can be seen as a single process actually. And when it's, I mean, feel free, especially those of you who are from completely different areas, who are almost everyone, I think. I mean, I would very much like input to this, because I took my PhD in computing science, and I think you will notice that this is still my sort of home ground when it comes to cognitive science. So, but we'll start off with a little bit of more neurophysiology actually. So we have this classical thing that you usually study one of the introductory courses in cognitive science, which are the two-stream hypothesis, where you have a ventral stream which is supposed to encode what, and a dorsal stream which is supposed to encode the how, or sort of the initially experiment when this was proposed in the early 80s, this was usually thought of the where stream. And this, when I speak about here, is of course visual perception primarily, and so typically what you see in a scene and how you select objects, so where they are in the scene, and then you have a parallel different process of what they are. And today this is a fairly, I mean, standard and well-established thing, but I will try to discuss this and put it into some relation a little bit. I will also mention the binding problem, which I actually brought up. This is really, how many of you have run into and are familiar with the binding problem? Some of the old. So I actually studied this also in one of the introductory courses, and then, you know, we learn it and we forget about it. But the problem here argues is that when we look at these two objects, independently if they are on a picture or actually physically, these are my beakers and this is my watch. So if we argue that these attributes of these objects, in this case, for example, the color and the shape, are processed parallel to the location of these objects. How do we actually bind these together in the end? So how do we sort of keep track of the binding between the attributes and the objects when we have a very much a parallel process? And this has been, of course, very discussed in relation to the two-stream hypothesis, since this sort of emphasized the actual sort of neurophysiological evidence of really separated streams of processing. And if you go a little bit deeper into this two-stream, or into the binding problem, you see actually two different problems which are of course related. So we have the segregation problem of keeping these attributes apart, so to speak, so to say, and the combination problem of then unifying these different processes together into what we perceive as a unified experience. So this is presented when, at least when I read it when I'm in the introductory courses in cognitive science, as a very sort of fundamental and to some extent philosophical problem in parallel processes. I mean, perception where you have parallel processes, so you get this kind of problem of actually synchronizing these things. And so I just want to emphasize that this exists even though we would, for example, give up the two-stream hypothesis. We still want to argue that the brain processes information in parallel to a very large degree, and then at some point we need to integrate information, and that is a very difficult issue. And then we have another classical philosophical problem related to artificial intelligence, of course, but also that you can see more general in cognitive science, known as the symbol grounding problem, where this is the original formulation by Harnard. How can the semantic interpretation of a formal symbol system be made intrinsic to the system rather than just parasitic on the meanings of other ends or other parts of the system. So, I mean, if we turn over and take my interpretation or my formulation instead, you can say that if we argue that we have, and we here as humans or as generic agents, where you can also include robots and such, would have some kind of mental representations. And as long as we think of these representations as symbolic to some extent, so existing within this symbol system, we would say that at least some, but most of the symbols have a meaning in the sense of a referent in the outer world. And given the fact that we argue that our cognition is built up on these symbol processing systems, how would we actually bind these symbols to some kind of external meaning?
Okay, so here is the time for a little question. I remember my car by a little visual image. Is that a symbol?
Depending on on the interpretation again. So you will soon see that my answer will be definitely no.
But is it in your formulations here?
I would say yes. I mean,
That's very confusing then.
Mm.
Are you also arguing that Harnad had the same meaning of symbol? So it covered icons and indices in persistence?
I would say that what Harnad argued is that on the level where you can do reasoning upon I mean, say that I want to drive somewhere, so I would need my car for something, and start to connect the car to other things in the world. On that level, the car would definitely be a symbol. To what extent, I mean, this would, strictly speaking, be connected to an icon or an image of the car, yeah.
Yeah, it seems that the word reasoning is also used metaphorically then. Now, how do you do reasoning on images?
No, I mean, in any case, even though you would argue that the image would be a symbol, we wouldn't really. It would be a package, right? So we wouldn't actually use the image content to do the reasoning. So it would just be a symbol with relations to other symbols in the environment or in the
So
symbol
implicitly,
system.
this is bringing in language.
Yeah. I mean, wait with that discussion.
Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, this is often, the symbol grounded problem is often framed in a language sort of setting where you would, of course, like to bind the meaning of words to some external physical artifact or so, or object in general. Okay, so now we jump over to something quite different again, and this is the well-known affordance idea by Gibson, where we would say that objects sort of elicit some kind of actions or action tendencies for humans. So when we perceive an object, we understand that very much in the context of what we can do with it. That was sort of the big thing that Gibson communicated in the late 70s. We can sort of nail this down a little bit, and when we look at it with some kind of computing science eyes, we would say and put some emphasis that these behaviors or action tendencies that an affordance usually sort of represents are more or less reactive. So that means that when I perceive my phone, I can, for example, grab it. That's one thing, or I can unlock it like this, or so on. So we typically think of these these kind of behaviors as reactive, as controlled to a very, very large degree by the current perception or what we see right now. And we can, of course, strictly speaking, also think of these kind of affordances also in a non-visual scene, so they are more driven by general perception. If we think of this as in terms of a robot, we can have a laser scanner, for example, sensing the distances to objects and acting on it.
Yeah. Would you say that an affordance is a quality of an object which allows an individual to perform an action, as you say on the slide, or would you prefer to build in the action potential into the property in the sense that it is a relational feature between an object and an agent? Because with that definition, every property almost could be called an affordance. Especially if you interpret allows an individual to perform an action liberally. The individual doesn't have to perceive that the property is affords any actions, for example. So it would bring in every normal feature of the world as we normally reason about it.
I mean, I think the question is perfect actually, because that is to some extent what I want to test and see how far we can really stress this. Because what is interesting here, right, from what you remember from the title of the seminar, is that what we perceive here is really an action. And my question is rather, if we really stress the affordance idea as to be what we perceive is truly what we can do with objects, then are there any actual, other reasons for thinking so, or how would that be related to what we can see in terms of neural processing in the brain and so on. If we dig a little bit deeper into the affordance theory, we have at least two classes of affordances, where we have stable affordances which are typically the same from time to time. So that would be, standard examples are size and shape of objects, for example. But we shouldn't lock this. This is trained for every single affordance. So if we have some kind of object that can vary very much in size, like a balloon, that would, of course, not be a stable property, but rather a variable one. And the typical example of a variable affordance is, of course, the position of objects and so on. If I would phrase this in more sort of computing science term, I would say that these are not strictly speaking two different classes, but rather, that we create some kind of probability distribution over different situations where we can see an object. And likewise, we create, we accept a certain range in the size of cups, but when we see a very, very large cup, that really changes our affordances, that it will be difficult to actually lift it. And even if we would, then that would cause problems, right? We would hurt our
But
back.
much of this is going to depend on your previous experience and learning. The classic example is affordances. If you see a bicycle, you know that you can only cycle on it, you can't do much else with it. But if you've never seen a bicycle before, you won't know what to do with it.
I totally agree, yeah. So, definitely, it's not some intrinsic property of the object that produces this. It's really our own experience with the objects that sort of constitute the affordances. Okay, so if we now then connect, this is relatively, new things, not in terms of the references here, but the connection is relatively recent, where we can see that some communication are going on, obviously, between the ventral and dorsal streams here. So that can be connected to this common notion of stable and variable affordances. So typically we think of this purely dorsal stream as sort of an online control kind of percept. So that would produce, in other terms, purely how we would interact with this object, right? Tjena Klas, välkommen. And that would then correspond to the variable type of class of affordances, while the stable ones would then correspond to what is more processed in the ventral stream, so sort of selecting particular objects and so on. And if you could say that in terms that this would be the actual sort of execution of behavior, while the information coming from the ventral stream would to a larger degree sort of support or select which programs, if you put it like that, which kind of controllers that would, strictly speaking, do the interaction with this particular object. So I found this discussion very interesting. This was actually done in a review paper by Serge Thill, which is yet another colleague to me and Rob. That was published now in the early 2013.
Can you explain the arrows on the brain in relation to ventral dorsal and dorsal dorsal?
I mean, typically we think of this as, I mean, I labeled it just with the colors here, but sort of we have this going down the side lobes of the brain as more the ventral type of processing, and then you have the dorsal stream going up more central towards the primary sensor cortex and the motor cortex up here. So that would, in that sense, also relates more to the actual, execution of the behavior.
But how do you link a ventral with dorsal then? I think that's
I mean, this is not illustrated in the picture. I'm sorry, I just took the same. And I would say, to my knowledge, exactly how these two streams do communicate is not entirely clear. But the fact that they communicate are established in several experimental studies where you can see that specifically the ventral stream sort of feeds information and affects the processing going on in the dorsal. Okay, so those of you who are a bit familiar with the subject would probably more or less wait for this type, because the mirror system have been debated over and over, I would say, since they first was observed. This review here that I refer to is one of this classic paper. Rosselotti was, of course, one of the big names in this discussion, where I think that the different interpretation of the mirror system have gone sort of away of what the observations are. So if we look purely on what was actually observed, at least initially, there was that neurons that do fire during execution of an action, both when the agent itself executes the action and when the agent, and usually an ape or chimpanzee, observes someone else execute the same action. And here I want to put some emphasis that these are specific things, right? So, for example, see someone hammering or using a certain tool or stuff like that. So if we would think of this as very generic, sort of do an action, then it wouldn't be very interesting, right? Because the fact that brain regions are involved generally both in perception and action are not very surprising. But the fact that we have very much the same regions in brain lighting up for specific things, both during perception and action, sort of create a very strong neurophysiological evidence for that there are some strong link between perception and action. Today, I would say that the interpretations have gone more and more towards that mirror neurons encode goals. So several studies have shown that they respond. The mirror neurons respond similarly, independently of how a certain action is executed, and more than on the effect or the goal of that. of that particular action, of course. And they are anticipatory, so they predict a certain goal, which of course made it a bit difficult initially to see that these were actually goal markers rather than just sort of responded to during the execution of the action. So that was, I would say, slightly more recent.
And a question. Are there any studies on the mirror neurons when you are neither doing something nor perceiving that same action? So you're just lying in your bed and you're thinking about hammering something. Same things? We don't know. Nobody has studied that.
I would guess that someone has, because soon it feels like regarding mirror neurons, everyone have tried. Of course, there are. I mean, the problem is that very few studies are actually done on humans.
Yeah. These fMRI studies were.
I mean, it's not really the same level of study as single neuron measurements, but I mean, certainly you have similar patterns of activations on fMRI studies, both when you do and when you observe, as well as when you remember something and when you imagine doing something in the future. So, I mean, this overlaps many different treatments of the same kind of action.
And it's all in the motor cortex, or?
No, there are quite a few different places. I would say that the premotor cortex is one of the most common ones to observe. So, of course, related to the motor cortex. But, okay. Where did we go now, actually? Did we? Okay, yeah, so one slide ahead. So if we take this sort of as a consequence, there would be then some motor programs or affordances that are guided by perceptual input, so this reactivity again of affordances. So in that sense, there is no explicit control, there is no sort of higher level or internal control in the brain that would say, now we do execute a certain action. And there would be, I mean, these motor programs would be suppressed to a larger degree than actually initiated or executed. And we can see that the sort of perception and action here can, of course, be separated in early perception or late action, so when it really comes out to the different modalities, but on a higher level, it is very much the same process going on. And this goes very much nicely into this frame of affordances, where these are, of course, something that we do observe, but at the same time, we sort of observe it as an action property. We can frame this in terms of kind of a hierarchical system where, again, we would have separated, and this would not only be separated into perception and action, but going more and more modality specific on the lower levels. And the lower levels here are very concrete, so if we think of this as the lowest level of visual perception is, of course, the retina, and then we go into V1 and V2 and so on, where you can perceive, for example, I mean, contrasts and movements of contrasts in certain directions and so on. So that would be low-level perceptor input, and low-level action would be very much what the cerebellum is doing in terms of concrete action planning and so on. And on the higher, more abstract levels, you have typically more longer time, more stable patterns of activity. You have more specific in terms of that maps in specifically to a single object or a single situation, and that's where we can find observations of this gnostic cell of the grandmother neuron idea, where we can actually do observations where some small groups of cells fire specifically to a certain, very specific to a certain person or that the agent knows. But they are also more abstract, so not, of course, connected to a certain modality or either perception or action. Often we come in and start to look at that. There is not like, there have been a lot of discussion, for example, I mean, we have known for a long time that the visual perception is a hierarchically structured kind of process, but there has been discussion of how many different levels there are and so on, where it seems clear that there are, I mean, distinctly different levels in terms of V1, V2, and V3, where you can really identify these levels in the brain, but higher up it becomes more and more difficult to actually separate them. And at the same time, they become also more and more tied to a specific situation and so on. So in this sort of framework, when you think of perception and action, we say that it's a hierarchical, but we typically don't number a certain sort of, a certain number of levels, and the number of levels or groups in this hierarchy that are interacting are a result of learning and training in different situations. So they vary over time and so on. And important to say, they of course do not correspond to anatomically separated regions in the brain, even though there are some, of course, some separations in clear. We can see that this is the primary motor cortex and this is the, primary visual cortex, for example. So in that sense, they are anatomically different and located in the same places on other people. But on the more abstract levels, they really go together. How many of you have heard of the Simon effect? Not so many, that's cool. I ran into this this example about a year ago when I was on a conference in Lund, and since then I thought it was really a weird and amazing something in one sense. Let's see if I can really present it in the way it is. I also want to say that this is not the original form of the Simon effect, but sort of an updated one, so to speak. So here you have a participant who should answer yes or no to the question, is this object positioned upright or not? So you do this, but they just see images on the screen and they just answer yes or no to questions. And strangely, what the experimenters observed was that this task takes longer time than this task. So if the handle of the object, all objects in this study was graspable to some extent, so they were everyday object that you could actually grasp and do something with. So there were hammers and knives and jars of different kinds and so on. And apparently a person can answer faster if the location of the handle is coherent with the yes button of the two buttons you are pressing. So in the experiment, I guess they used just two different keys of the keyboard. And of course you can switch this in different conditions and you get the various, but in all cases it takes longer time if the handle and the yes button are incoherent, so located on different sides. And in the original setup by Simon, they were actually just located on different sides of the screen, so in that sense not really using the handle in that case, but later it's been shown that this works also with the handle. So my question when you start to think of this is why? I mean, now I've listed to a large degree a lot of observations, right, of how, at least possibly how perception and to some extent action can be organized in the brain. But we see very few studies of that tries to really give some kind of motivation for this. So why would we be equipped with some kind of perceptual system that would sort of answer this faster than that? It seems to be very few sort of, I mean, direct advantages of that kind of system.
Could it have to do with left and right-handedness?
I have looked for that kind of evidence, and if I'm not mistaken, I think there are only right-handed people in the initial form of this experiment.
How does it work if you put the handle on the other side and swap the yes around? So yes is on the left side.
It's the same effect. Yeah. Oh, I think that it takes longer time, but still the difference is there, if you say so. And I must also say there are like a whole bunch of different variations of this experiment today. So I can give you a list if you want, and I have not looked in detail on all of them. So I mean, they have created all crazy, and it seems like this basic conclusion that at least when it comes to familiar objects, when they are rotated in different ways, the hand you respond with have some kind of effect. And apparently it's not in all cases that the coherent effect is positive. It might take longer time, but at least it stays that the effect is sort of there. Which is, in my opinion, this is a very important finding, because it actually affects the way we do experimental studies on humans. Like if we must take to consideration where we put the keys and how we put the keys, that sort of adds yet another level of possible effects that we might find just by coincidence, because we haven't done this kind of control.
Yeah, but is it always about the term upright?
No. There are the original. I think the original presentation was. The idea here is that you ask something else, which is, non-related to this, the fact that where the handle is and so on. And there are also, different levels of here it's just only an effect in timing, right? So it's not like people answer less properly or do more errors or so when you rotate it. But it's also been shown that it has to do with the sort of level of analysis that the person has to do on objects. So if you start to ask properties like how is this object related to that one, and which sort of requires a deeper cognitive analysis of the object, then there are other kinds of effects. They are still there, but the picture becomes much more complex.
Isn't it just quite simply an affirmative action? That reaching out is equivalent to yes. It's just so simple as that.
You go ahead of me. Yes, I would say that today this is one of the leading interpretations of this, that we do some kind of covert action in order to test this. Is this upright or not? Because that would be an efficient way of doing that. And if we are testing that on a cup that is rotated the wrong way, then we would need to add some kind of mental rotation on the object, which would require some time. So that I would say is the main interpretation. But it's still a little bit speculative, honestly. We can't only argue for this.
Have any experiments been done with left-handed people?
No, as I said,
that would be like really interesting to understand.
I would guess also that the picture there is more complex. That's just my intuition from many of this kind of clear. Typically left-handed people are not as left-handed as right people are right-handed.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So yeah.
This is more complicated.
Yeah, exactly. But I myself have just, please, sorry.
Continue. I mean that the mental rotation hypothesis is of course one, maybe the, I don't know, more plausible than the one I thought of first, which is that in line with your general reasoning, that when we perceive something connects to action, and perceive a cup when interpreted as a cup is to involve, for example, the right hand, if vad kallar man örat på botten?
Ja,
The hand.
handen, ja.
Yeah. Is in this, so you're then prepared to use that hand for some action, and you're also going to use it for pressing down a button. It will go quicker if it's the same hand as you have already involved in perceiving the cup. That's not a materialization.
No, I guess, but they are kind of similar, right? In the sense that we do argue that still the classification is done as some kind of covert action, and then to what extent we do a mental rotation of the observed object, or that we synchronize the yes and no answers. I actually personally think that your conclusion or proposal is more plausible than the mental rotation. But
otherwise, nature would have done something very stupid.
Yeah, maybe. But
rotate everything.
oh, well, I don't know how does your head works. Yeah,
But would you see the same phenomenon if you just asked what color the cup was, for example? Then it would be
no,
totally meaningless to keep rotating it.
No, it needs to be some. I mean, that would just require a very low-level visual analysis, right? So
there you don't see the sign on it.
No. And I think this. I haven't studied this enough to really give a deep, but there are, like, you can analyze several different of these levels where the Simon effect is one of them, and then you have both sort of, I mean, prior levels where the Simon effect doesn't show up, and you have levels after where the picture is much more complex.
You could perhaps test for the mental rotation effect by viewing whole operations in terms of priming, and then test if you use other objects where, and then expose them to some actually rotated thing.
Yeah, that would be
An
interesting.
experimental guy, I don't know how to do it, but then it would predict that they will do it faster if they have mental rotated at once already.
Yeah, but yeah, that's an interesting, because I haven't seen anything that can really separate these two cases where either it's a sort of a synchronization of the motor system or a mental rotation, and that would, yeah. Okay, for a later discussion maybe. Okay, so now I will switch over again to something quite different, and sort of go back to my home area, I must say, in some sense. So that's robotics, of course. And when you see this, I want to think of what you see in terms of a learning context. So, I mean, we can build robots to do a lot of stuff, and we have succeeded in many areas, primarily maybe in industry and factory floors, where robots can do very precise kind of movements and sort of understand the situation and react and so on. But so far, at least, we are much less successful in everyday environments. And the reason for that is that it's difficult for the programmer or the designer of the robot to really know what kind of situation that the robot will end up in. But if we could have the robot learn by experience, of course, that would be much facilitated. So if you take a beginner's course in control theory, one of the two first concepts that you run into are this notion of forward and inverse kinematics. So the forward kinematics would, of course, answer what will be the result of some action, so where will I end up if I do these actions? And the inverse is to ask if I want to go to this particular state, which action should I choose, or which sequence of actions? And typically when we do this, we think of the state here as the, for example, the tip of the pen. So this example is a robot sort of transcribing the Bible. Why ever we wouldn't want a robot to do that. So yeah, this is just an elaboration where the inverse kinematics then is sort of the problem of really selecting actions depending on some kind of goal. And typically we formulate this as a controller. So this is really what the controller of the robot is doing. Right? It takes in some state of the environment, and the state here can be understood as our internal representation or mental representation of the world, and compute some action. And we can do this either as to in a single time, like this. So this would be called a reactive controller, or we can do it as a whole plan, or then it comes into a whole own area of robotics where we do planning and sort of search for a nice combination of actions to fulfill our goals. And the forward one, more generally, can be understood as the ability to look into the future. So that would be not only the ability to forecast one step ahead, but if we can do that, we can really apply this and sort of see what will happen if I do this and if I do that. And this is typically not how we understand forward and inverse kinematics, right? This is the forward and inverse kinematics is really where do my arm move if I execute these actions on a robot with arm with multiple joints. And typically this is a difficult problem in itself, because we have many combinations of the different joints that will have the tip of the robot arm end up in the same external state. So there is a non-one-to-one mapping here, because we have a problem actually selecting suitable combinations of such actions in terms of reaching, not reaching like this, but actually producing some kind of motion that is stable in different aspects or energy efficient and so on. And this might seem like a corner case, but in robotics this is a huge thing. We can, for example, in Umeå, some people worked on autonomously moving the gripper with the arm of a forest machine. So this forwarder that takes trees from the ground and put it on the transport or the flak, what do you say, of the forwarder. And just by having this kind of inverse kinematics controller for it and do parts of this movement autonomously, you can reduce the fuel costs for this by more or less 10%, just by always moving the strong parts of the arm primarily, and not using using a short arm during the whole motion. So here I really try to extend this idea into two very fundamental things of both observing sort of the consequences of actions and also, of course, compute that in relation to some desired state or goal. And this would be quite fine if we just could define X here. So the big question when we come to learning is, of course, which attributes of the world should we include in our representation? And this is, I typically take the example of a chair. So, we have the chair, you have the property of being able to sit on it, so some kind of affordance-like thing again. We might have a certain height or width, and so on, and then maybe the number of legs. So we can enumerate a huge number of possible attributes for this chair. But it seems that independently of what kind of ontology we choose here, there might be situations where we miss something. So let's say that I want to stand on the chair, then it really becomes relevant what kind of material the legs are made of in me to judge whether this chair will break or not, or how stable it will be, and so on. Or maybe there will be other things where I really are interested, is there some kind of dot here or dirt, or which may be included then in your representation of this object in some situations. And you end up with sort of an exploding world of possibilities where you might want to add some new information to this object. So selecting a nice ontology or the right attributes for representation is of course a huge problem. And then finally, maybe you could say that you have the problem of selecting the right goal. And in robotics, this is I would say, a quite new area, since we are typically thought of thinking goals that is something that comes from the human and comes from someone else in terms of we want to teach the robot to do that, and therefore that becomes the goal. And it's not up to the robot to decide that by itself. But still, if we want to understand robots as a more generic sort of agent able to act in the environment, it's clear that we as humans, right, form our own goals, both on the long term and on the short term level, and the robot must be able to do the same. So if we look into this is a very quick overview here, so I realize that I really go between subjects, but if you go into machine learning, you have a whole range of different techniques where you have what we call supervised learning, where you have sort of the very explicitly mentioned, this is the goal, this is what you should produce. And then you have the class of unsupervised learning methods where you have evolutionary algorithms or things like this, where the goal is still there, but it's typically hidden within or expressed in less precise terms, so to speak. So to take the genetic algorithm, the evolutionary algorithm for an example, you would say that we define a fitness function, so we define what makes the simulated agents fit to the particular environment, so we have something to select upon, and therefore we can do sort of simulated evolution. But we as humans or designer of this algorithm have still to make the decision, of course, what will be the purpose or the thing that makes these agents survive. And in the middle, maybe what is becoming really big in robotics is scaffolded learning, where I mean, those of you who come from psychology are probably familiar with the notion that we as parents, maybe mostly, when we teach our kids, for example, to bike, we do not really, you can't just step on the bike yourself and have the kid watch and hope that the kid will actually learn something, but rather we just help the kid bike by itself, and then you just support the kid so he or she will not fall and hurt himself. So you basically limit the task until the kid can do it by itself, and then you sort of release the restrictions as we go along. You remove the scaffold and make the task more and more difficult as the experience of the kid increases. So that was this builds also on Vygotsky's work, right, where you have the zone of proximal development that's very much related to this idea of scaffolding. And so just pointed out that these two areas are sort of floating together, but still I would say that we very much miss some idea of how the robot would by itself form the idea of what is good in the world, and then to define goals by itself. That is not really present in this classical machine learning presentation. Actually part of what this Rob is working on right now. So if we boil it down a little bit, we can say that we want the robot to learn how to reach goals, so the inverse kinematics in a very much a generalized sense. So we want it to be able to forecast consequences of its actions, and we want it to form goals, compute these relations of where we want to go in the world. How am I doing in time? Yeah. Okay. So, So I will try to now take what we have seen both from the cognitive science area and from sort of a pure robotics angle and try to boil that down a little bit. So if we want this robot to be able to learn actions or learn this initially here, the forward model, the idea of forecasting the forward kinematics. Then we again end up with this state-based problem that I mentioned before, but there are techniques around this. So one way would just be, for example, motor battling, to let the robot just move the arms, whatever you wanted, and then you see where you go. So you can build this model of, if I do this action, I end up here. And then you can do this in the sensor and motor domain. So you would just execute some actions and then observe what is going on. So you see where your hands are moving, and then you can use the camera for doing this. And again, a little bit like Jens' question then we would really store these precepts as a processed version of the visual stimuli. Mathematically, we would formulate this as a predictive model. So note here that I have removed the x, so we don't assume a certain world state here, but we rather say that, okay, if we have this precept and do this action, we can do this prediction here of the next precept. And typically this is not like we predict a certain thing, but again we formulate a probability distribution over the data where if we do this, it's likely that I will observe these things. And so we can set the sort of precision of the prediction in that sense. And the inverse would be what we know as a reactive controller in robotics. This is something that is usually taught on introductory classes in either robotics or artificial intelligence, where you would have a simple controller that doesn't take the state here, but rather a certain stimuli and compute an action. And those of you who were here at my last presentation, this relates to the Brighton-Bay vehicles, for example, or Rodney Brooks' work on sort of reactive small robots that can run around and avoid obstacles and in that way achieve some kind of abstract goal in a very stable way in a real world setting. But of course, completely without any kind of real understanding of objects and so on. That is not really there. And then we can start to combine these two. And so what we do here is we do produce predictions all the time. In each, if we think of this as discrete time, so here the distance here can vary, of course, but in most situations, in practice, we think of this as maybe 100 milliseconds or something like that. So in every time step, you do compute the prediction error between what you actually observe and what you thought you was supposed to observe in the just a moment ago. And then you use this prediction error to suppress the controller, such that you say that if the prediction error is very small, the controller we are doing fine, right? The controller is actually doing what it's supposed to do. And then we let this controller to be in control. But if the prediction error goes up, then we suppress the signals, making this more like a covert action. So we still compute the actions, but we don't really send it to the muscles of the robot, so to speak. And then, of course, the action here goes back into this, so this becomes like an internal loop. And this has also been formulated in cognitive terms within the simulation hypothesis. This is Heslow's work that some of you may know, where now we really think of this not as robotics anymore, but we think of this as an agent, where the simple agent would sort of now in terms of insect kind of behavior, so to just have a stimuli response kind of thing, where some external stimuli produces some neural activity that corresponds to this stimuli. For example, some activity in the visual cortex. And then we have some implementation of the controller, some stimuli response kind of behavior, and we produce some response to this behavior. And there's of course a loop so this 1 and 2 here is in time, of course. So we step forward in time, 1 step, and then the agent will produce some different or new response as a consequence of the new action or the new stimuli. But this kind of system is very limited, right? Every time we see this kind of stimuli, we will react the same. So in some sense, it's you can't really have memory in this kind of system. It's only sort of in reactive stimuli response kind of behavior. But what Hessel here argued is that what happened, evolutionarily speaking, is that we got a shortcut. So we got a system that can, given a certain computed response here, before we actually send this out to the muscles, we do a shortcut and feed this as a stimuli again. So this here would, of course, correspond to the forward model that I just spoke about. So given a certain response, we compute a new expected stimuli. And then, based on this, we can, of course, start to do covert action in the sense that we start to produce an internal simulation. And this is hypothesized being sort of the explanation for the fact that I can close my eyes and see my apartment at home and me walking around in the apartment. So in that sense, I am computing covert actions of walking, and my nervous system is producing expectations of what I will perceive in this particular case. So in that sense, we are computing aspects of the world, but grounded in our sensor and motor systems.
The term computing here,
Yes.
that might have some basis in robotics, but how much does it have in what humans do? I guess you're talking about we, us, humans.
Yeah, of course.
So causal reactions of various types, are they really always analyzable as computations?
I mean, I would say as a computing scientist, I would of course have to refer to what the Turing machine can do. So that is, given that we have all the parameters, we can transform a certain process to a new state in a very complex pattern, and in that sense.
But in the end, this would have to come down to quantum mechanics.
Yeah,
Can a Turing machine really do quantum mechanics? I don't think so.
Discussable, yeah. No, I think in its original formulation, no. Yeah. So this is the big discussion with quantum computers, for example. Yeah. But when I speak about compute, that's essentially what I mean, right? So much of what we argue that the brain is doing here is statistics. So, I mean, it just produces likely presets that I have received in a certain context of my apartment, for example, and then these patterns are more likely to reoccur based on, if we want to cause compute. So there is not really any strong emphasis here that the neural system or the brain would be Turing complete in the sense of the classical Turing machine. So being able to theoretically compute everything that is computable. And it's also difficult to really compare this in terms of the fact that the brain is inherently parallel, which again changes the matter completely from the traditional computing science context.
Jens, when you brought in quantum physics into this, I mean, were you sort of subscribing to the idea that quantum effects are found in the brain?
Yeah, I actually I am very interested in that, and I do seriously entertain that as
good.
possible. Sure.
Interesting.
Yeah. You don't?
I'm certainly open to it. I wasn't a few years ago, but I've become more and more open to it.
Yeah.
I was thinking I should produce some kind of comment to that, but I feel like maybe I should stick to my presentation. Just to give an answer, I also think that relation is very, very interesting, and to what extent that the brain, I mean, that quantum computing actually adds something new. A short answer can be that from what I've seen algorithmically, some processes, some kind of algorithms can be computed much, much faster, astronomically times faster than what we can do with a traditional sequential computer. And one of the things would be encryption, for example. So this resolution of primes, while other things which are quite easy to solve on a traditional sequential computer are much harder to do on a quantum one. So it seems to be two different worlds where and if quantum computers will come into play, I think that in practice it will not affect our understanding of cognition as much as it will break down all security on the internet that we have so far. And that will be the really big turnover.
Do quantum computers actually exist? I've seen them named all the time, but I've never actually seen one.
They exist.
They exist, but they are, I mean, can be very limited. But they are sort of increasing this a little bit all the time.
Okay, but you are limiting the discussion to computers, but some of us here are really interested in
because I don't know.
Animals. You know, even if we're doing humans and animals, we have to think about what.
Yeah. I mean, and I guess that's also why it is two quite separated themes here, right? Where in many parts of computing science, we focus a lot on the complexity of a certain algorithm. While in this discussion, I don't even mention that, because to evaluate to what extent these algorithms that I propose are actually implementable on a large scale, on a sort of human kind of scale, is a completely different question, of course. And it might very well be that we formulate an algorithm which just grows in complexity so that we can never really actually implement it in practice. But again, so we don't run away too far in time. One role here of prediction, why we would like to do internal simulation, is of course to overcome delays. And I often think this is it can't really be emphasized enough, because even if we have a really, really fast stimuli response system where the brain would be able to compute the response in zero time, we would end up with a situation where sometimes we actually have to initiate an action before the particular stimuli is there. So, and just, if nothing else, thanks to the fact that our muscles are slow and it takes a certain time to get to the right pose where you can execute that action that you really wanted to, and so on. So by having a system that could sort of forecast these consequences and still allow us to actually formulate a reactive controller based on stimuli that we haven't really perceived yet, overcomes this limitation. And by that sort of creates a very nice sort of shortcut where we can start to do things in much more complex terms than we could with a just classical reactive one, where we have to actually perceive a certain stimuli before we react on it. So this is one use of the notion of prediction and the motivation for prediction in the brain, of course. The other one, which is less emphasized and in my opinion just as important, is the use of multiple goals. So now assume that we have a single controller here, paired with one predictive model with a phi there. And then what we get here is basically the limitation that every time we observe this and this, we do predict this, right? So we can't make a distinction between, I don't know, I often take this example of me sitting in the office and then I'm going either to go fetch my mail or go grab a coffee in the coffee machine. And I can think of these two situations as I sit there, but when I walk, I usually lose it and then I go grab a coffee even though I was actually thinking of checking the mailbox. And one sort of explanation for that would be that the percepts that I get when walking in the corridor in Skövde is exactly the same independently if I'm going to get the coffee or the mail. And during the time that I sort of go there, the sort of go coffee controller takes over and I go there even though my intention was something completely different. So in technical terms again, what we emphasize here that this is solved by having this controller can just do one of the two, right? It can just fetch a mail or grab coffee. It will not be able to do the same since the sensor percepts that we get in the corridor on my way to the coffee / mailbox is the same. So that's the limitation.
They could be different, actually.
They could be different, and then there would be.
Because it's more risky if you bump into something when you have a coffee cup in your hand.
On that level.
So you could be looking for obstacles to a greater extent.
Yeah, when you go back, they are certainly different. Because then you also have the coffee in your hand and you can see it, and that becomes sort of this embodied marker of what am I going to do right now, right? But it's the way there that is the problem. But it could be different in the sense that it would be completely different routes if I go left from my office door to grab coffee and right if I fetch the mail, then the problem is also much smaller, right? Okay, so what we do here is to bring in the world state again, but only as sort of an implicit assumption or marker. And what we say here is basically that this controller A here, let's say that the grab coffee controller, works under the assumption that there is a world state where I actually wanted to have coffee. You could, of course, formulate this desire for coffee as an internal state of the agent, which I don't do now. So we just say that the fact that I want coffee is something that is just present in my office, not anything anywhere else. Otherwise it would break down the discussion. And this one would be the goal for the mail. And now if we want to sort of differ between these two, we will say that even though the actions produced, at least under some sensor consequences, are very similar, at some part these two controllers would differ. And also in some situations, for example, while I'm in my office, the prediction errors of these two would be slightly different. So I would, for example, see the coffee missing, or I would go and, oh yeah, I should have something in the environment would have reminded me that I probably should go.
Explain the term bootstrap here.
So the bootstrapping here is done that we never represent this world state explicitly. So that would be the information that distinguish whether I would go for mail or coffee here. So in a traditional system where you would just do the inverse kinematics and construct a plan for how I would go and fetch either mail or coffee, so that would be the goals, right? Then we have to represent that world state explicitly. But here we say that we bootstrap the world state. So we never do this, but we just have the two controllers, and these x's are actually not there explicitly in the equations. So that's where we come in. And when we want to learn something like this, we can do that also in a similar way. So we would just have a whole bunch of possible controllers, and you can almost think of this as different affordances now. Maybe affordances that my office sort of allows or elects. So that would be sort of sit down, take off your shoes, stuff like that. And initially, before you learn it, these controllers and predictors can actually be quite random. So there would just be random distributions of what I can do in different situations. And then this becomes a little bit technical now, but what we would do here is to produce an action, and then observe which one of these random predictive models that produce the smallest prediction error. And if we have, let's say, 100 different models, one will produce the smallest error, even if that error is quite large, right? And then we train only that model to minimize the prediction error, while the other ones are left alone. And in this way, we can start to distinguish between different world states without explicitly representing aspects of the world that is there. So we can, we can start to actually act upon things that are no longer present in our surroundings. So that would go more and more towards this notion of internal representations that we have. Okay. So now I wanted to just show a short little demo of an implementation of this kind of system. But before we go for that, I just wanted to draw a little bit of possible conclusions and also some speculation maybe. So some consequences of the argument I have made is that it would be much more difficult to separate goals if the interactions with the world, the things that I do in a certain environment are similar. So this classical example again, we're fetching coffee or mail. Learning is much faster if we have a reactive setting. So if the environment sort of bears the information that I need to decide upon a certain action. We can learn things that require longer timescales and memory and so on, but that requires a conceptualization of the situation. So that is typically something that we shouldn't expect children to see in a completely new setting or environment. So common actions are preferred over optimal ones. So when, for example, navigating in a city or for that matter fetching coffee, I would be more likely to go for coffee as long as that is what I usually do in that kind of situation. While if the environment is completely new for me, I would not rely as much on these common habits, if you put it like that. Motor programs or affordances here would execute autonomously as their predictive models match present circumstances, unless they are actually explicitly inhibited. And that is basically, I mean, again, the notion of affordance, where we typically think of it as something is inhibited rather than explicitly executed. And there is an argument about the notion of use of hierarchy here, which I have not gone into deeply today. So some speculation related to the mirror system maybe that what we today perceive as or understand as the mirror system is mainly these goal-seeking, so goal-deciding neurons that will, in that sense, it's these forward models on a relatively high scale. So on a scale where the modality of the input, so the motor or percept, have grown together into a single process, and what we see are these modules of predictive or inverse models. And the forward then will mainly be the or the mirror neurons will mainly be the forward models in this understanding. So from that, there follows that there would probably be neurons with very much the same kind of function, but much more modality specific. So we would expect to see similar neurons in V1 or V2, which fires explicitly on the reaction or predicts a certain aspect of a movement, or if you put that and identifies a very low-level kind of goal. And this is, I must say, speculation. I have no idea if there are such observations or if this connection is already made. But my interpretation of this is like that. And of course, in that case, we would lose the mirroring property. So the mirroring here would be the wrong term. This would be more like goal neurons or something like that. And I think that the name would be different if we would have found this neuron under a different setting. So if these are true, then there would also be implementations of the inverse model, sort of reactive controllers. And we can expect these to be primarily found in the dorsal stream, that we the dorsal stream. So this is how computation and more motoric executions of actions. I haven't gone far as to actually sort of guess upon some actual experiments to validate this or falsify it. Yeah, we can always guess. Okay, so let me see. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so I just wanted to make this a little bit more concrete, maybe by having this little robot simulation. So this is just a simple simulation of this white robot here that you see that I can control with a joypad that can run around in this environment. And this robot has a sensor that senses the distances to things around it. So it sort of creates an array with distances to all the things in the environment. That's a classical laser scanner in this case, which is also a common, very common sensor to use not only in simulation but on physical robots. And when I worked in Umeå, we did work on this actual robot also in a physical version. So what I have done now is to drive this around manually with a joypad, and I have trained a set of different paths. And in this case, I use two controllers. So I have two sets of demonstrations, if you put it like that. So I train one where I start from here and I go to the kitchen. And I use another one where I start over here and go to the TV, which you actually don't see here. Let me adjust the picture. So over there is the TV, you see. We can put it like that now. Now let's say that I don't label this in some way. I just would say that we train this using this predictive and inverse models as I described. Of course, I described it kind of loosely here, but we can train these kind of statistical models in the computer. And I should just start it. We set them both. We just put all the training data in as a bunch and then run it. And we should expect to see something like this. So the robot runs, but right here we no longer know where we are going. So right now it actually did the right thing, but we have a sort of a 50% chance to go instead to the TV. So if we just go back here and I can start over here instead. And run it again, we will see that, yeah, this time it took the other route. So when we're in the route, then we are fairly sure, then we sort of, the environment tells us where to go. But when we are right over here, the robot doesn't really know. And this is what I have referred in my thesis as to knowledge interference, which I think is a very interesting problem, where you see that to some level, more training data to a robot will increase the performance. So, of course, the more you train, the more patterns you get, the better statistical models you get, and you can do your predictions better and better. But as the diversity of your training set increases, the performance also goes down. So in this case would be a typical one, right, where you need clearly to separate between these two cases. And what I have done here is to use a version. What we can think of is, I will let this run now and see if we can do. So now the controller is actually, it is running, but it's right now, yeah, now it will do something anyway. It stands still because it hasn't seen this pattern of activity before, so it doesn't compute an action. But as we come into a situation where the robot would be, you see that now it did something. Let me see, if we go over here, it would start to sort of hook in and start to put us on this trail, and now it would start to go to the TV, and I can try to put it away again.
Why doesn't it go under the table?
Sorry?
Why doesn't it run under the table?
Because that I haven't trained it to that.
Okay.
Of course, I can drive it into the table if I want to. Yeah. So what I just wanted to sort of pull here is that this sort of have some kind of similarity with this common notion of affordances, right? So we have sort of the environment always trying to kick in and draw the actions of the agent into a certain setting, a certain behavior. And this behavior is reactive, so that the current sensor input decides the present action in all situations.
But the more you train it, the less important I think the notion of affordance should be.
Yeah, to some extent you're right. I mean, if we train it to a really fine-graded set of different possible actions, so to speak, it becomes more and more difficult to actually tell the difference between one or the other.
Yeah.
And that goes a little bit away from this classical notion of affordances, right? So I agree, and that's also one of the things that I have emphasized in my work, that we shouldn't really, even though we draw this, and this is, I must say that, I mean, oh no, this is wrong screen, sorry. If we go to this slide, where we would say that we have a number of, this is called a mixture of experts architecture, where we have a number of these forward and reverse models. We do not in any way actually want to say that these can be enumerated in the brain. That would be a bit ridiculous to say that we have one model for grabbing a cup and a completely different one for I don't know, lifting a cup like this and like that. But on some level, these are certainly different controllers, but there is sort of a continuum between the different versions. And I have, in the implementation we did in Umeå before I started in Skövde, we sort of played around with this continuum of different controllers. You can have sort of a mix of two experts, two controllers active at the same time. Okay, I think that produces the end of my talk, so thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Okay, now we have more time for discussion. I'll start by one question. The notion of attention has been conspicuously absent in your talk. It seems to me that attention is driven by forward prediction, you might say. Prediction, sorry. So when you're going for coffee with coffee cup in your hand, you're going to be looking out for things that you could stumble on. And so that's going to drive your attention. You'll be more sensitive to such things, and you'll pick up that kind of feature from the environment. You never build any robots that have attention.
Yeah. People certainly do.
You do, yeah?
It's just that I didn't bring it up. And I haven't, it's true that I haven't in my own work, focused on attention, but I do not at all want to neglect it. Of course, attention is a huge and very important area, and it also goes, the work on attention goes strongly in the similar kind of footsteps as the kind of architectures I presented here, because you also speak typically of a mix of top-down and bottom-up attention, where you would have some aspects of the environment, like if someone would start to scream here in this room right now, that would be very much a bottom-up kind of attention, right? So that would certainly draw all the attention from me and to that person. While more a top-down attention is where we have some intention or inner state that drives us to, for example, if I'm a bit hungry right now, so these sandwiches looks more and more interesting, right? So that will be the top-down, and that goes very nicely together with this idea of a mixture of bottom-up and top-down information, which I haven't spoken much about.
Okay, let me make that mixture a little more concrete. Let's say I'm walking in the forest instead of in the corridor.
Yeah.
So now my attention will be on where do I find paths that I can walk on. So I'll be looking for paths. I will not keep very close attention on if my feet are stumbling into a branch or something like that. But it seems that, at least my experience is such that I'm usually able to avoid stumbling into these branches and stones. So it seems to be that I have a reactive kind of mechanism going on at the same time as I have my attention stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, so is that what you want to do too? You have these completely reactive mechanisms where you would not need to involve some notion like attention, combined with those which are more attention.
In simple terms, yes. What you have to take into consideration are on what time scale we are speaking about as reactive here. I have in this talk simplified the presentation that just said, t+1, and then I took the example of this t could be, let's say, 100 milliseconds. But when we speak of this, if I go back to this notion of this hierarchy slide, here, we are arguing that here the t is very short, right? So here we have a very short-term reactive model. But this reactive model is supported and to some extent suppressed by another reactive model which is working on a slightly larger time scale. So in that way you do get some memory sort of into the picture, but it's a memory formulated in reactive terms still, and in contrast to where you would have explicit states sort of stating yes or no here or something like that. But in principle you would, as long as everything goes well and you walk in the forest, you have this kind of unconscious and reactive model taking the control until you get a large prediction error that would be you stumbling into something, and then that draws your attention and sort of includes a more cognitive analysis of the situation.
But your model here seems to be like a scale where you have many different steps.
Yes.
But a very popular book right now by Kahneman seems to invite us to think that there should be 2 levels only. Does your model contradict that?
To some extent, yes.
Good, because
Even
I have a
though-
model
even
where I
though
used
I-
to have 3 levels.
No, as I mentioned, we have been in this discussion a number of times within the SSKKII community,
Yeah.
and it's it's still a huge debate, I must say. I mean, if you follow this, there would be more or less one of the same kind of mechanism working from a very short, small time scale up to reasoning. So there will be more or less one kind of system, but acting on different time scales and therefore producing completely different results in that sense. And among these, there would be a continuum. You wouldn't really be able to distinguish enumerate a certain number of levels. But at the same time, we must also agree that this is very much a hypothesis. I would say that we have good support when it comes to relatively low-level behavior. So things like the hierarchy of the visual cortex, for example, and to some extent how we compute goals and sub-goals in motor planning. That is also very well established, and we can see a similar kind of hierarchical pattern in both these. But when it comes up to purely cognitive level, when we can sit back in the chair and solve Sudoku, it's still very much an open question to what degree that truly is the same kind of mechanism or not. And I guess there are also strong evidence against it being the same.
Can I ask you what's the software or language that you're using for planning? Is it kind of strips or?
No. If we used strips, that would be a much more classical sort of planning thing, and I didn't really go into that. But if we flip,
strips is very limited. And you need the board is very clear.
Yeah. Okay. So we are here. Good. What the only state space that I use in this case is the perceptual space of the robot. So this laser scanner and the actuators. So they are basically one control for one wheel and the other for the other wheel. So two wheels, and then just a support wheel which is passive. And so in that sense, what the robot is doing when it is, let's say if we go back and then we take it to drive here some area here, and then we put it on. What I do now, we don't have a position sensor here. So the robot have no idea where in the environment we actually are. But no, it didn't work. Okay, so now I sort of draw it in. So you can see here when I play around a little bit that now it may have got a little bit off, and it will sort of drive into...
Oof, what's this?
This is when it fails. But you saw it still sort of got back to the same situation. And this is a result that what the controller does is not really a spatial task, but we have a stimulus response kind of thing saying turn a little left when you see this pattern, turn a little right when you see that pattern. And in that way we can create something which actually will go to a certain location in that sense. But I could have trained it to dance or to just go around in a circle or something else, of course. And it certainly doesn't really plan in that sense. We just select a certain pattern of previous controllers. And it's rather the mixture of these that creates new behaviors. So in one sense, we are just repeating what we showed it to do during the demonstrations, so when I controlled it. But in another way, it becomes something new, since the exact interactions with the world and the mixture of all this previous knowledge will never be exactly the same twice. So that's how you should think of it. And the language that I use is Java, for those who are interested. And what we see here is a common robotics platform called MRDS, or Microsoft Robotic Studio, which I think is pretty good. There are many of these standard both simulation platforms and sort of middlewares for physical robots that you can use today.
You can use the same software even for physical robots.
Yeah, exactly. So when we have been running exactly the same program we set up on a physical robot, and then you more or less just flip the switch and you get the same thing to the real one, which is very important if you want to do testing and so on. You want to keep this as tight as possible.
Does your work also include learning about other robots? Robots learning about other robots?
No, it doesn't.
No. So you have single agent cases.
I think that's a very good good comment, since much of the, specifically, or if you want to speak about the mirror system, right, that has been debated in I mean, the context of understanding others. And maybe one part of what I want to emphasize is that I don't think that that's the original role of these kind of neurons. I think that they play a very important role solely for interacting with the environment and then by itself. Even though, of course, the consequence is a neat gain in understanding also other people. But there are certain difficulties in terms of, I mean, here what this robot does is to really recognize the sort of predict what I am going to see in direct terms. We have value, we will have value 365 on the laser scanning coming from that angle, and value 400 on another angle. That's the kind of predictions that we do. And when it comes to understand others, we can't really do that, right? We need also to translate the percept that if I am to predict your actions, and I argue that that's what the mirror system is really doing, I need to also translate my understanding of the world to your. And that is, in my opinion, a part which hasn't been really discussed, or I mean, it's discussed a lot in the general context of mirror neurons, but it's not really in computational terms. That's a difficult thing to do that kind of mapping.
Any example of applications?
For this kind of system?
Yes.
Yes and no. I mean, in practice, what the robot will be able to do is, of course, I mean, with this kind of thing, it is very limited. Mostly because of the physical properties of the robot. What it can do is more or less drive around. But it has a certain of direct, nice properties that we haven't really seen before. And one of them is this kind of implicit navigation, right? So it can find its way. We have tested this in different parts of the environment, and it doesn't really take that much training before it can find its way from any position to a certain location without any global positioning system. So in situations where we don't have a GPS, we can still actually create a robot that can navigate within to find different routes and so on. And potentially it could be used in maybe restaurants where you would very much have a changing environment all the time. So that would be difficult for a robot that does planning, because then you do a plan and okay, I should go there, and then some person steps out and then you have to adjust the plan. Everything, it becomes really much difficult in that sense. But if you have this more sort of learned behavior, you could learn, a huge amount of different patterns or behaviors to do in different situations. And each of them would just be micro solutions to your program or to your behavior. But in overall, if this is done in the right way, then a nice behavior would emerge sort of allowing the robot to act also in very sort of traditional, difficult situations.
I just bought a copy of The New Scientist on the way here, and I just flipped through it and saw it was, well, the whole issues about consciousness, and one of the questions they raised was, we'll never get anywhere understanding consciousness until we begin to ascribe consciousness to robots. Do you think that's a reasonable proposition? Can we reach a complexity? In a way, it links up with what Ian said a few moments ago about Kahneman. Kahneman has level 1 and level 2, or what psychologists use the term the cognitive unconscious. And psychologists are very impressed by this, and they try to reduce psychology as a whole to computer simulation. Perhaps you're not aware of the great impression it has on psychology. Do you think this is a road that will follow in the future? Can you make any predictions? Do you think it's correct? Do you think we'll ever reach a stage of describing consciousness?
Yeah, yes, and no. I mean, well, that's a bad answer. I would say yes, definitely. We should try to sort of describe consciousness, or actually we were in a similar discussion just last week when Daniel took his PhD, and he worked on the notion of presence, or the feeling of presence in a certain situation, or in a virtual reality, if we put it like that. And to what extent we can give that a computational sort of measure or definition. And again, attention is yet another word that we can discuss in the same effects. And yes, but I also think that when we do that, we will change the sort of initial. There is no reason to believe that the everyday use of the word consciousness would correspond to one of the same computational property of the brain. The sort of guess I would try to go, if I would answer the question today, is to say that this robot is right now not conscious, due to the fact that it doesn't really do long-term prediction. So it just is still stimulus response, and we can switch between different models, in this case of go to the TV and go to the kitchen, based on simple reactive rules, more or less. But if we would use these models that we do have here already to do internal simulation, to really forecast on long term what will happen if I do that, and then evaluate that against some emotional system, and then go back and then choose another route based on the fact that I got a predicted or simulated emotional response thanks to my ability or this interactive model that I built up. Then we can start to think of conscious processes as this notion of internal simulations in more long run. So that would be maybe, if I would draw some kind of line, I would draw it there. I wouldn't really sort of, if we take this hierarchical, let's see where we're here, notion again, it would be very difficult to place sort of here would be the conscious level, but it would be more likely to say that the long-term stable properties of these interactions with the world are to a larger degree conscious than these low-level interactions, right? So that would be another way to discuss it. But I think it's a very interesting question.
Well, my understanding is the potentiality for using this kind of planning robot and so on is huge, because now it's not very expensive to get such a robot, and even programming. I mean, this it's changed enormously, and just since I started to do my PhD, this was 6 years ago now.
and that, I mean, now you get so much for free, and you can buy a robot for. We just discussed a week ago. You can get these 2-arm things with very nice sensors and so on for just a few 100,000 kroners, which just a few years ago you couldn't get that for under a couple million. So
What does it do? What does this actually do with 2-arm thing?
I mean, well, what was the name of this robot we discussed? It's this with a face.
Which one again?
You know, the one Tom sent an email about. It was.
I can't remember.
We have a so-called Nemo and so on. It costs about 5,000 euros.
Yeah.
And it has 2 arms.
Does it have a face?
Yes. The face is about, you have this,
I must
they
always.
can see, but really don't really see, just remote. But I mean that naturally we must say that this is in the beginning. We didn't starting this is very easy, but
Yeah.
we need you to plan it.
Did you say we have one here?
Yes, because we have in Nemo or something else. It was in TV4 and they are using as a teacher. Yes, that's right. It's very famous and several. I didn't think so. BBC or CNN and so on. Even they had. They're working lärande kommunikation.
Yeah.
Yeah, Walmart.
Yeah.
This is a European project that several countries.
Oh, there it is. Boxster.
Yes.
But this was only 4,000 or 5,000 euros, and what you said was like 20,000 euros. But
But this one was just 5,000.
yeah, I heard what you said.
Maybe. Can we just switch? Oh no. We need a plug. I lost the internet connection.
But maybe you can just say something about what it can do.
Oh no, I can't. I don't know if I have a
So
key for this.
we have to come to a closing, Erik. Maybe you could wrap the whole
Anyway,
thing up.
I don't know if it can. Maybe you can just see here on Rob's computer. It looks very nice.
It looks kind of dangerous. I guess it could strangle.
We had a long discussion of why they put the face there.
But that's about 20,000 euros.
Yes, I think so. Mm. I mean, I think this is really the transition between traditional factory floor, you know, these KUKA arms or ABB kind of robots, right? Which you typically had to put in a cage and at least, you know, have very protected from humans just because they were really dangerous. And nowadays, thanks to the new kind of sensors and also to some extent the kind of control they are using, they are inherently safe to a much larger degree. So you can actually have these in interplay with people, which you couldn't. I mean, even if you were a really good programmer, you couldn't have a person working on the same table as the robot at the same time, because if something went wrong with the robot, it would knock the head of the person. And we typically don't want to take that chance. So I think safety here is really the one big thing that changes the picture. And I mean, when still we are on the level where you know, people are asking me, certainly from media, when the big robot apocalypse will come and the robots will take over the world, and I still say that we fight to get over the threshold. So, you know, it's a bit away. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I think our interest in robots has been kindled again, so we'll probably continue to talk to that.
Okay, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.
Tack så mycket. Det visste jag inte. Jo. Gift eller? Jag tror inte att jag har hållit för så det brukar vara ett sånt här samling.
Jag tänkte just det, jag säga att det så
Ja,